Greetings and welcome to another edition of Montpelier Connection. I'm Mike Merwicki, State Representative for the now Wyndham 4 District of Putney, Westminster, and Dummerston. And this is my mentor and senior district mate, David Deen, from the same district. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me on. This is great.
It's great to work with you again this year, to work with the Dean of the House, literally and figuratively. And we have just concluded the 2012 legislative session. We're back home, and it is great to be back home.
Yes, it is.
And back to real jobs, paying jobs.
Yeah.
And
you're not living out of a suitcase.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is a strain at best.
You bet. It's hard to be away from home for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
And that's one of them. But it is great to serve you, our constituents out there. And I feel like it was a very productive session this year.
Yes.
We started with the remnants, the administrative remnants of two major floods last year. This time last year, Lake Champlain was at record levels, flooding numerous towns and creating millions of dollars worth of damage. Then, of course, more statewide was the Tropical Storm Irene damage. Now, David, you chair the Wet and Wild Committee, Fish, Wildlife, Natural
Water Resources.
Yep. How did that impact your work this year?
Well, it was a major portion of our work. In the early part of this year, we moved a lakes bill out of the committee and through the House that addressed some of the issues that you mentioned in terms of the record levels in terms of Lake Champlain. Beat the old record by over a foot. And it redefined floodplains for the Lake Champlain basin. Not only the lake itself, although that's where most of the damage from the high water was created, but also some of the tributaries coming into the lake. And then in the second half of the session, the House and Senate swapped bills. We sent them a lakes bill, they sent us a rivers bill. And we spent the second half of the session, not entirely, but a major portion of it, dealing with what we learned from Tropical Storm Irene. Both the lake situation and the river situation from Irene pointed up a significant problem with Vermont law. Vermont statute exempts a class of activities from floodplain zoning, agriculture, forestry, state buildings, public buildings, and FEMA, and they were an important part of our recovery from the two high water events, said, no, you can't do that. You can't have these exemptions in place. You've got to manage the floodplains in order to protect infrastructure, property, and lives. So between both bills, a major portion of it was to address the requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program. And if we had not, it is likely the next time something of this magnitude happened to the state, a lot of people would find out, to their dismay, to say the least, that there was no insurance coverage for what they experienced in terms of their loss. So that was a major piece of the work. The other thing was that we discovered in our committee hearings that the Green Mountain National Forest, over the past several years, 5, 6 years, when they have been doing culvert replacements and bridge reconstruction, they have been using a much higher standard than Vermont has over the recent past in terms of the size of the culverts. Now, the size of culvert is an issue for the health of the stream, and it has to be sized properly or you create a break in continuity in terms of the stream. So river advocates have been asking for bigger culverts, more bridge clearance in the interests of the stream.
Well, these are for public access, not necessarily if you have a culvert in your driveway.
In your driveway. No, this is, roadways. Every time a road crosses a river, there's either a bridge or there is a culvert. So with river advocates have been calling for larger size culverts that are sized to the size of the watershed and what the expected high water flow might be. Well, the Forest Service changed over to these larger size culverts, sized to the watershed size of the stream, and lo and behold, they didn't blow out in Irene. And it was an aha moment. So we have changed the structure and how the state will move forward in terms of both the Agency of Transportation and the Agency of Natural Resources having these higher standards that are better for the rivers, and they don't blow out in flood situations, saving tax dollars. And so it ended up being a real win-win situation.
And given the realities of global climate, weird weather, whatever you want to call it,
Right.
This sounds like going forward, it's really a proactive way to do our business.
Right. I believe the word of the session was resilient, that we wanted to make Vermont more flood resilient. And this was one of the major ways of doing that. Changing standards in terms of road crossings across rivers, making sure that Vermont communities and the residents in those communities were still eligible for the National Flood Insurance Program. And it's an individual responsibility. The town has to maintain, or the state has to maintain, a set of guidelines for floodplain development, meaning as little as possible and none in most places. And then the individual homeowner can purchase flood insurance. It's not like the government insures everybody, or the town does, or the state does, but the state has to have things in place in order for that individual homeowner to be eligible. So on both the insurance side and on the infrastructure side, our roads and bridges and buildings, we learned a lot. And one example is the state complex at Waterbury that was flooded out by the Winooski River. And the reconstruction that is going to go on there is going to remove the buildings that are in the floodplain. And that portion of the main complex, which is still very close to floodplain, is going to be flood-proofed. And one of the interesting things you can do is put a building up on piers, the way we build houses in Putney, and let the water flow under.
Yeah. Now, we all had full agendas going into the next legislative session, the session of 2012, before the storms hit. In your committee, I'm sure you had a full agenda of work, leftovers, stuff that came up. Besides
Yes.
storm-related legislation, what else were you working on in your committee?
Well, I think the biggest thing was that we took on the hydrofracturing technique for gas and oil. The science is a mess in terms of what the impact of that technique of exploring for gas and oil and in fact capturing it. And at this point, there are conflicting studies done by industry, done by the government. Some places they're saying, yes, it has in fact contaminated the groundwater. In other places they're saying, no, it hasn't contaminated the groundwater. And I read two conflicting reports today. It was really kind of interesting. Both the industry and the advocates against hydrofracking use the same language. And I was wondering if they had the same script writer. But that aside, we passed a bill out of the House that created a moratorium on fracking The Senate sent us back a bill that created a ban on hydrofracking, and the legislature settled on the Senate version. And we now have a ban on hydrofracking exploration for gas and oil in the state of Vermont. First state in the union that has done that. Some are saying, you know, who cares? Vermont doesn't have gas deposits. Well, we in fact have the same shale formations in the northwestern part of the state, including under Lake Champlain, as Quebec does, where in fact active searches for gas and oil are going on. So we created a ban. It was fairly contentious towards the end as we were considering that, but eventually it became a bipartisan vote in terms of supporting that piece of legislation.
Now that went through your committee. I think the legislation was originally introduced by Representative Tony Klein.
Yes.
Just want to give credit where credit is due.
Yep.
Tony has been working hard on a lot of different environmental issues, and this was something that was very important to him.
Yeah, to him. Yep. Yep.
I supported that, and I voted for it. And there's another reason, though, that I think this is a bad thing for Vermont, and I think it's questionable whether it's good anywhere. From what I've been researching about, this is not just fracturing the environment, but it's fracturing communities, where communities are being torn apart over the contentiousness of whether this is polluting, whether it isn't, the influx of people into small communities. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of planning that goes into where they start drilling and the consequences of it. And it's one of the things I think Vermont does very well in, that we look forward when we have to think about what we're going to do. And I think this is some forward thinking on our part, and I'm glad we're able to do that, both from an environmental point and from a community standpoint. Our communities are what will bring us strongly into the future, despite any outside influences. And I believe that...
Or in spite.
Or in
spite
in
of
spite
outside
of
influences. Yes.
Those influences, thank you, yeah. And I think as we want to go forward into an uncertain future, that these are the things that'll make Vermont stronger. Our communities, our forward thinking on environmental issues, and preserving our environment for us and for generations to come. Our rivers, how are they doing?
Well, our rivers are beginning to recover. They are still extremely sensitive to any kind of rain. People who drive over rivers or use them have probably noticed that if you even whisper the word rain, they turn muddy. And there's a lot of silt and fine material that was deposited after Irene that is still washing out and being flushed out of the rivers.
Those satellite pictures were just
of
hard,
the mouth
hard
of the
to
Connecticut
see.
River.
Yeah.
It was just amazing. So what I'm hearing from fish and wildlife biologists is that the rivers have moved around, but that people are still able to take decent-sized fish. They're just doing it in different places because the river has, as it is wont to do during a flood event, changed. This year is not really the acid test year. It's going to be next year, because this year those fish that manage to survive the high water, and they're very good at it, and a high percentage of them, maybe 60, 70% of them did survive, those fish are still in place. Whether or not they have a successful spawn will be reflected in oncoming years in terms of fish populations in our stream, and we might see a decline over the short term. One of the things we also did in the rivers bill that we were discussing earlier is, after the storm, the human intervention caused a great deal of damage that was unnecessary. Had people been more sensitive to the dynamics of a river, what a river requires in terms of being a river. So one of the strong focuses in the Rivers Bill was to, in fact, get that education out and get it out to everybody and anybody who owns a big yellow machine and might find themselves operating in the rivers of Vermont, to be able to do it properly. And one of the things that we've tasked the Agency of Natural Resources to do is we want them to create a checklist, right, about that size. Here are the do's, here are the don'ts, and it sits on the dashboard of every single piece of equipment and truck, and whether it's a state or a municipal or a private operator, here are things to watch out for in terms of what you do to our rivers. Because Irene had an impact, but then we compounded the impact on the rivers because of our activities. So we're also setting up a training institute that everybody from AOT to private contractors is going to be eligible to be able to go to better understand how to deal with rivers. So, you know, we did try and address those problems. But you can't do anything about a flood. If a river's going to flood, it's going to flood. What we wanted to do was minimize impact in terms of infrastructure and property. And then we get back to building in floodplains. Worst damage to both infrastructure and personal property were those things that were located in that floodplain that a river needs in order to drop the force of the flow of water. So we are strengthened protections for floodplains also.
Well, speaking of what we should or shouldn't do, you have a little visual aid here for what we should or shouldn't do when we're boating.
Yeah, potentially, I guess that's, potentially, boaters have probably seen these on the kiosks at the boat launches up and down the Connecticut River. And it's getting around to being boating time again. And we want to make sure that people understand that this is something everybody has a responsibility to do. And it doesn't matter whether you're a power boater or a canoeist or a kayaker, skin diver, or I guess that's what they call it. It's not one of my sports. It is people that move non-native plants from one water body to another. And if you're going to be using the waters of the state, in fact, waters in any state, you have a responsibility to that water. You get the pleasure out of it. That water belongs to you under the provisions of the public trust doctrine, so it's your water. It would be somewhat akin to throwing trash out onto your front lawn. And so we're asking people to check their vessels, check their personal gear, clean it up, make sure that there are no plants, no mud, no creepy crawlies or whatever left. And if you can't completely clean it up, you don't have the facilities for doing that, then in fact let it dry out. And a minimum of 48 hours, preferably up to 5 days in the sun, and everything that, because these are all waterborne invasives we are concerned about, if all the water's gone, they in fact will die.
Yeah. Now, this is not just your boats, but your boots too, right?
Absolutely. If you're moving from, if you're a wade fly fisherman the way I am, Vermont has banned felt bottoms so that you cannot wear them in these streams, because they were one of the biggest reasons that things like whirling disease and Didymo were moved around into different watersheds. The ban went into place, people are respecting it, but even if you are using the new rubber-bottomed waders, you still have to clean those because the webbing at the top of the boot, it's not solid, it's not a solid material, it's porous, and that in fact can lead to spreading. So whether you're walking in the river or boating on the river, please take care, respect our rivers, and help them out. There's nothing you can do about an invasive once it's in a body of water. The only real tool is preventing it from getting there in the first place. So always, always think, if I'm going from this body of water to this body of water had an invasive in it, and I have a responsibility to make sure that I don't spread it.
Well, we looked at a lot of different things.
The time to show that.
Sure.
That's
Well,
cool.
I think it's important, and a lot of us don't think about it, or it's new news to us, and the only way we can spread that is if we start here and spread the word.
Yeah, and these will be replacing those that have weathered, and will be replacing the posters at these at the kiosks at the launch sites.
Well, we looked at a lot of different things during this session.
Yeah, your committee was extremely busy.
We were busy. Working together with the governor, we were clear that health care reform needed to move forward. We're reacting to the realities that all Vermonters are experiencing. More and more people are paying more and more for their health care, and they get less and less for it. This is not a sustainable situation. We're trying to move forward in a way that will cover all Vermonters, increase our outcomes, and decrease the amount we're spending. We took another big step on that this year. We started the process, first of all, of seeding the Green Mountain Care Board, which is now designing our new healthcare system. And then we lined up to what's happening in federal healthcare reform with our healthcare exchange, which should be online in 2014. And if people want to go to the Green Mountain Care website, there's a lot of good information on there on how we're progressing on that. There's a number of other things that we looked at this year in terms of recognizing that this is a changing world we're living in. How we evaluate progress we're making is one thing we looked at. And in the past, we tended to look just at economic progress, and we passed a bill which it's called the Genuine Progress Index. And when we try and measure progress for Vermont, we want to take into account the quality of life issues. That is what brings us to Vermont, which I think sets Vermont apart from a lot of other states, and what keeps us here, and I think can be attractive. So going forward, we're going to be doing some research, creating some indicators which will take in not just monetary progress, how the economy is doing, but also how's our environment doing? What are the social indicators in our culture that make life in Vermont the wonderful place it is, and how do we maintain that? I think it's reflective of a more complex world that we live in, and that it's more than just dollars, but it's good common sense that makes Vermont what it is.
One of the things that the legislature overall did that you can transition directly from your discussion about the genuine progress is the Working Lands Bill. That's right. To be able to protect our working landscapes so that the feel and the look and the sense of Vermont will remain the same into the future, not denying economic activity, but in fact making that working landscape, our working forest and our agricultural land, be it milk or other agricultural products, an economic success so that people and the land can continue to work. And we have that same sense of our our view of the state of Vermont. Strip development is not an answer to true economic development, and more we're finding that out on a very broad scale of economic studies around the country, and this was an important step. And not only did we set out a policy, but we actually gave the policymakers some tools in order to move forward with that working landscape bill.
I think the Gund Institute at UVM is going to help discern which indicators we want to use, and as we move forward in the general progress index and with the working landscape, these are all ways for us to create a Vermont that can move into the future and help us compete and build on the brand we have now. Small is indeed beautiful, and that's one of the attractions to Vermont, but how do we compete with larger states? And I think the working landscape bill is going to help create sustainable agriculture in a way that we can keep us small instead of thinking we have to compete with all the bigger industries. The value-added products that each farmer or in the timber industry can bring to Vermont is something that benefits us all as we move forward into a future. And it's an economic driver that I think the governor has recognized, that this creates jobs, it creates a sustainable economy, and we would all do well to look forward.
Yeah, and one thing, I mean, Vermont does need to move into the future, but think about the recent past. Take a look at the style of employment in the state of Vermont in terms of the number of entrepreneurs, one person or two people who have started a business, and that those activities are in some ways tied to the working land. And then take a look at our unemployment rate. So that in fact, this approach, as opposed to having mega businesses relocate into the state of Vermont to in fact grow an economy from the grassroots up, does have resiliency. The word of the session, it makes the economy resilient in terms of people being able to earn a living. Now, that said, yeah, it still takes 2 jobs in Vermont to make a living, and we all recognize that, but we made that choice, and we've made that trade-off, and lo and behold, it works up here.
Well, I work 3 jobs, you work a couple, and that's the reality. We know that's the trade-off here in Vermont, and it's certainly worth doing. Resiliency is something that I appreciate that we're putting out there. My work in youth and community development over the years has been focused on creating resilient youth. How do you create youth and communities, build communities that can sustain through the hardships that are normal through youth and that the pressures of communities feel? And I think we're looking at that in terms of our economy, in terms of our environment, and as we move forward into the future, we do well in general to promote resiliency. Mm-hmm. We're looking at, I think we have a few minutes left here, the future. We've both talked about this. It's as good a place as any. We'll be running again.
Yes.
I look forward to working with you. Should the voters decide to send us back to Montpelier. Anything that you would like to talk about now and hope we can get to work on next year?
Well, I have had a long career in the legislature, and I am also getting to a point where I would really like to retire, but I'm going back for this term. I am running again for this term because of what is in that river and lakes bill, that there are going to be necessary actions that will have to happen at both the administrative and legislative levels that I want to see through. And so the work that we did this year was a first big step to being able to move on into the future, as you've said. One of the big questions that's still out there is EPA overturned the cleanup plan for Lake Champlain, Vermont's cleanup plan for Lake Champlain. They were supposed to have a replacement plan, according to the law, this time last year. And it's still not here, and it's probably not going to be here until this time next year. That plan is likely to require legislative action because of what EPA will require. So I'm going back for my rivers and lakes.
Great. Well,
and you're going back for?
Yeah. There's a couple of things that we started this year. Healthcare reform, I think, is an essential opportunity. It's vital to all Vermonters. We want to create a system where we have better outcomes. We want to create a system that has universal coverage in Vermont. And it's something that we're moving forward to slowly. We're, I think, moving deliberately in a way that will create a system that is sustainable. Within that, though, we've also are reforming how mental health services are being provided. We took a big step on that this year. Because of the storm, the psychiatric hospital that we had in Waterbury had to be closed. And what we did was we moved from an old institutional-focused system to a recovery system where closer to the community, more services will be available, and hopefully less acute services will be needed. And we want to help that process move forward. We took a big step in designing that system this year, working well with the governor again, who showed a lot of foresight in helping something happen that we've been trying to do for a decade now and change the way we deliver health care to those Vermonters who are experiencing mental illness. There's another issue that I'd like to put forward, and I've been working on for several years. We've started a statewide initiative called the Positive Fatherhood Initiative. It's a group of people who are trying to create a culture which can support fathers who are doing really well as fathers and bring into that fold fathers who could use some help in improving, who want to be a more positive part of their children's lives. Now, this is not the angry dads that you may hear that are in the news sometimes who are fighting about custody issues. But what we're doing is try and create educational opportunities, try and create support opportunities where fathers who want to be a more positive part of their children's lives can do so with the support of older guys like me and their peers who are fathers that are working together with their kids and with their families to create stronger communities. So that's something I'd like to work on again, and I look forward to working with you. I look forward, hopefully, to working with Governor Shumlin again. I think Peter did a great job this year under very trying circumstances, and I'd like to see what we can do in a session that's not dominated by natural disasters.
Natural disasters, yeah.
So, I want to thank BCTV again. They are doing a great job in helping bring what we do in the State House closer to home, and hopefully next year we can do some more reporting from the State House and keep you all informed. One of the things I want to close with is a reminder that this is 10 years. Every 10 years we do redistricting in Vermont based on the censuses that come out. Our district did not geographically change, but there was a numerical change. It was previously the Wyndham 5 district. We're now the Wyndham 4 district. We'll still be representing Putney, Dummerston, Westminster, so there'll be a little number change. Hopefully you won't notice it, and hopefully we'll still be providing the same high level of service to the wonderful people we represent.
Good. Well put. Thanks.
And thank you, David, and thanks to all the people from BCTV, and thanks to you for watching, and look forward to another year and move forward with Montpelier Connection.